Something you should probably know about me is that I collect old Warhammer 40,000 miniatures. A shocking revelation, I know. When embarking on such a thing, it helps to have an idea of what sort of goals you're aiming for. Do you just have a handful of favourite models that you want to track down, or do you want to do something more formalised and collect all the models from a certain release, like collecting all the C-100 Space Marines for example? Or do you just want enough of them that you can field a legal army in a given edition? However you choose to do it, it's always really satisfying when you manage to complete a full set of whatever you're doing. Something that I managed to do recently when I managed to grab the last of a trio of models I've been after. Now, they might not look like they have much in common, but trust me, they do. Let me explain. In the early days of Rogue Trader, many models were given specific names. These were often references to pop culture. Here we have Marine Medic Kyle and Captain Reese, the cast of the 60s Batman show, and how could we ever forget Communication Officer Orinoco? And sometimes the names would just be based around some unified gimmick, like the squat names being based around guns and gun manufacturers. It was basically a big hodgepodge of references and bad jokes, and that's not a judgment, I am a fan of this. But for some reason, 3 humans from 3 different lines were all given the same name. And what was that name? A name that we must now assume is the most common one in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium? Morris. The name was Morris. There was Mad Morris from the 1987 RT-7 Mercenaries range, Trooper Morris from the RT-5 Imperial Army line, also from 1987, and finally, Brother Morris from the RT-1 range in 1988. That is a lot of Morrises to release in about half a year. Trooper Morris is fairly unremarkable, but still a solid early Imperial Army mini, sculpted by Ali Morrison. His accentuated proportions, the big hands, the big feet, skinny legs, add a lot of charm to the figure, and the apprehensive look on his face is a particular joy in a world of angry, shouting men. Speaking of which, Mad Morris was either shouting angrily or struggling with the world's densest gun. His name kinda suggests the former, but it's unclear. I particularly like how his hunched pose makes him look like he hasn't got a neck. Although initially sold as a mercenary, he looked so close to the Imperial Army models that he could eventually be brought over into that line. Although since they already had a Morris, he would get a name change and become Assault Trooper Hardy when sold as part of that line. We don't have a specific credit for who sculpted him, but since the only shared names on both of his releases is the Perry twins, it was most likely one of them. Finally, we have Brother Morris, seen here boldly wielding a multi-melter and bolt pistol at the same time. From my understanding, this is also an Ali Morrison sculpt given away by its somewhat flat beak. It's actually an interesting thing about this era of Marine. You can often tell who sculpted it just by how they interpreted certain details on the design. His one-handing of the melter does actually give him a pretty interesting non-conventional shoulder pad, since a regular one just wouldn't have worked in this pose. And it neatly shows off just how much bigger multi-melters got over the years, as hefting one like that now would be a much bigger ask. Now that's all well and good, but why are these 3 all called Morris? Now, don't get me wrong, no offence to anyone out there who's called Morris, it's a completely fine name, nothing wrong with it, but it doesn't exactly scream dystopian science fiction. Maybe it was just a nod to GW sculptor Ali Morrison, he did do 2 of these minis after all. Or maybe it's a nod to the Morris mini, since these are miniatures, so it's a Morris mini? Seriously, if you worked in that department of Games Workshop in the 80s and so happen to know why those 3 miniatures are called Morris, then please let me know in the comments. I would love to find out why. Over the years, GW would stop giving specific names to non-character minis, and those that originally had them would lose them. The only names they'd be allowed were things like Bolter 3 or Space Marine armed with multi-melter and bolt pistol, which are far less fun, and, especially in the case of that last one, sometimes astonishingly specific. But whilst they still had names, these 3 were called Morris, and that amused me enough to track them down and then make this video about them. Which is now over. Bye.